Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about reaching more people through inclusive marketing and communications. Apologies, I'm just going to switch to the second slide. So my name is Carla, and I work on the UN Global Compact Network UK's social sustainability and integrity activities and projects. And joining me today are Steve Kenzie, the Executive Director of the UK Network, and Sarah Brown-Fraser, who's the Marketing and Communications Manager at Activity Alliance. Sarah is an expert on inclusive communications, and she has kindly agreed to deliver a presentation on this topic and share some of her knowledge with us. Now more than ever, we feel like it's important to ensure that different companies and organizations are as inclusive and as accessible as possible in their communications. So this webinar will try to shed some light on how this can be done by exploring best practices for inclusive marketing and communications, specifically in business. And this webinar will also provide practical advice for companies wishing to make their outreach strategies more accessible for everyone, including colleagues and clients. So our agenda for today will start with an introduction to the UN Global Compact, which will be led by Steve, after which we will move on to Sarah's presentation about inclusive and accessible communications. The last 15 minutes will be dedicated to a Q&A session, during which Sarah will be answering any questions you may have. You can send in these questions anytime via the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And during the Q&A session, you will also be you will be able to unmute yourself to ask any questions you may have. And as you can see, we are also using PowerPoint's automatic captioning system to try to make this webinar a bit more accessible. Apologies if it doesn't work perfectly. We realize that it's automatic, so it's not as good as having someone transcribe everything in real time, but we still think it's good to have something. And we will also share this recording and the transcript of the webinar with all of you, so that you can revisit it in 2 different formats. And on this note, if you are having any technical difficulties, please feel free to let me know about this through the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on the 3 little dots at the side, you should be able to enable the chat function. And if you are for some reason having issues dialing in via your computer and joining the audio via computer, you can also join by phone via the dial-in details we sent you this morning. So I will now hand it over to you, Steve, and thank you.
Muted, I do that every time. Thanks very much, Carla, and welcome everyone. I'm hoping you can see my screen okay now. Is that true, Carla? Can you?
Steve, I think you may have the wrong screen up.
Okay, so we thought we were. Better?
Yeah, that's good now.
There we go. Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much, Carla. Thank you all very much for joining us. This is a topic that we feel really strongly about, particularly in these days when so much of our interaction is taking place online. It's critically important to our agenda relating to the Sustainable Development Goals that no one be left behind. And we know as an organization, we have a lot of room for improvement. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Sarah, and I'm going to be very brief now. For those of you that are not familiar with the Global Compact, just a few words. It is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 10,000 companies and another 3,500 non-business organizations participating globally. It is therefore a multi-stakeholder initiative working to create the world we want and to align business with these 10 principles. This is the foundation of the Global Compact, what the whole initiative is based upon. These principles have been drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor standards, environment, and anti-corruption, which makes for a very robust foundation for any corporate sustainability program or supplier code of conduct. It is comprehensive and truly universal. To join, it requires a CEO commitment to the UN Secretary General, and that commitment has to comprise 3 elements. Firstly, to operationalize the 10 principles of the Global Compact throughout the business operations. Secondly, to report annually on progress towards that objective. And thirdly, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is very clearly the Sustainable Development Goals and the implementation of the Paris Climate Accords. To support that, we are very much a global and local organization. Our headquarters at the UN in New York leads on a wide range of programming, and there are local networks in 68 countries around the world, and we look after the UK. Our role is to support companies in the UK that have made the commitment to join the Global Compact, and we offer a wide range of programming to assist our members. At the moment, there are over 540 UK-based participants, and certainly we would very much welcome you to our midst. And just finally, our programming at the local level in the UK is divided into 3 broad pillars: the global goals, climate action, and business and human rights. And within our business and human rights programming, we've got work that we do on, we have a modern slavery working group, a diversity and inclusion working group, a child labor working group. We're also doing an initiative called Target Gender Equality, which is a global initiative to empower women in the workplace. All of these things are open for members to participate in, and if you'd like more information, we certainly would welcome you getting in touch with us. Without any further ado then, I'm going to pass over to Sarah, and we'll get into the substance of today's webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Hi, Sarah, I'm just going to share my screen. There we go.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks for joining. If you don't know who Activity Alliance are, we're a national charity who focuses on the inclusion of disabled people in sport and activity. But what we're going to talk about today is actually quite transferable in any sector that you work in. So I'm going to stop my video because I have to read some notes as well, so you don't want to see my face or the side of my face during the presentation. Okay, we're back to square one. So we've established 20 years ago, and we work with members, partners and disabled people to challenge perceptions and change the reality of disability inclusion in sport. So disabled people are twice as likely as non-disabled people to be inactive. So we feel obviously inclusive communications and marketing really helps to try and demyth those the myths that might be about disabled people being active. And it started around 2014 when we brought out the Inclusive Communications Guide. We found there was a lot of barriers that are so similar across different sectors that actually a lot of sectors were talking about it but not really sharing that information. So we as Activity Alliance found that if we brought out a guide to help the organisations that we work with, could we actually change some of those perceptions and actually help with some of the barriers that exist across sport and activity? However, we found that a lot of those barriers exist in so many sectors that a lot of different sectors were actually downloading our guide, asking for advice. We deliver workshops, and we've been quite successful in this area for the last sort of 6 years. And you can download that guide, which is on our website, which is activityalliance.org.uk/communications. About 2 years ago, we realised that 45 pages might be a bit to read for a lot of people. So we shortened them and made them into different topic areas. So you will find on that same website that there will be different topic fact sheets that you can download. So if you're, work in social media, or you might work in digital communication, that might be the fact sheet that you might want to download. So the important thing is to know the wider picture in the landscape that we work in. So just to give you some of the top line facts, disabled people have higher poverty rates than the rest of the population. Almost half of people in poverty in the UK are in a household with a disabled person or are disabled themselves. Employment rate for disabled people is lower and multiple disadvantages in the labour market. Half of disabled people say they're lonely, and 1 in 4 feel lonely every day. And if you think about the present situation that we're in, you might find that obviously disabled people are more likely to be isolated, more likely to be less active. There's a lot of things that disabled people would fall into or be the hardest hit in our society. And a quarter of non-disabled people admit to avoiding engaging in conversation with a disabled person. So what is the business case? In terms of market power, 1 in 5 of us is a disabled person. So when I say us, it's because I am actually a disabled person and I use a wheelchair. But the UK population continues to age. This is a vast majority of our society that we need to consider as part of our business case. So the purchasing power, if you think about spend, it's worth around huge £274 billion, and that was in a piece of research that was done recently. The click away pound, so the pound that actually you might be losing on your website because your websites aren't set up accessibly, is £17.1 billion. Businesses that fail to meet the needs of disabled customers could be turning away a share of £420 million each week. And cost cutting on inclusivity can result in higher costs later. So you might find that actually people might ask you to change your websites, make sure that they can make it available in different formats, and that would cost you a lot more money. So it's the right thing to do. It's everyone's responsibility, and it's good for your brand and it's good for your image. And there's a piece of research that's just been released recently, and one of those quotes that came out was from Lloyds Banking Group, and they said, "Our focus is on becoming much more cost effective by building accessibility into all our processes. That way, it's there right from the start, just business as usual." And that is when I talk in a lot of our workshops, we talk about from the get-go, you should be thinking about inclusive planning. You should be thinking about putting accessibility in from the start, because if you have to try and add it at the end, it can be more cost effective, it can be a lot more costly, and actually it might take you more time as well. So why wouldn't you want to reach more people? Accessibility is good for our brand, presence and positioning, and barriers can be permanent, temporary or situational. So when you think about disability, a lot of us might think about, well, they're in a wheelchair, they've got a vision impairment, they've got a hearing impairment. But actually all of us at some point in our lives will face disability, which might be permanent, temporary or situational. So if you think about when you're driving the car and you try to look at adverts on a billboard, because you can't be looking at billboards, you would be situationally not able to see the advert. You might have a cataract, so you actually temporarily, you wouldn't be able to see something that you get put through your door. So thinking about this situation is not just black and white for disabled people. We all will face those issues. We all have preferences. So we all probably prefer to receive something on email. We like to delete it when we feel like it. Those newsletters we all sign up for, are we actually wanting, you know, even 20% of those newsletters we sign up for? Our habits and abilities change. And you'll see that at the moment, actually, during the lockdown period, where a lot of us have moved to digital. What problems does that cause for a lot of our audiences? And our staff and customers may become disabled at some point. So do we want to retain that talent and custom? It's important that we actually show that we care for our staff and our customers. So ask yourselves, we know what our audiences look like and their preferences. Do you? And we can look at our audience in terms of, this is across society. So if we think about if we look at all the audiences that we might be connecting or communicating with over your time, 51% of the population in England is female, 49% of the population in England is male. And if we look at disability, 75% of disabled people have more than one impairment. That's the average about 3, actually. So don't be thinking about disabled people as having just one impairment and the one barrier that you might have to think about as part of your communications. 21% of people in England have an impairment or health condition. That's around 11.5 million. Now I'm talking about England because Activity Alliance actually works across the home nation for England, but obviously in the UK it's around sort of 14 million. So you are thinking a lot about your audience there. 2% have a learning disability, around 1.1 million people in England. 63% of disabled people are over the age of 50. 1.5 million people are living with sight loss, and 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health issue each year. And 9.2 people in England have some form of hearing loss. Now, language and communications, 8% have a main language other than English. That's around 4 million people in England. The top 5 other languages are Polish, Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali, and Urdu. If you are looking at the whole of the UK, well, Welsh would be in there too. A lot of you might already translate to a different language. So you might be thinking, should I be looking at the different locations and actually thinking about what their top languages might be? The average reading age is 9. So when you're writing for a mass audience, are you thinking about what level you're writing for? 10% have dyslexia, 15% are functionally illiterate and would not pass their GCSE English. 1 in 5 disabled adults have never used the internet. And on that, actually, there's a lot of talk at the moment about digital access. So, and if you were to think about how many people have digital access nowadays, just to give you a few stats on that, 1.9 million households have no internet data. They can't afford it, or they can't have access to fixed term contracts. 11.3 million in the UK don't have the basic digital skills they need in today's world. So even if you were to give them internet access, would they actually have the skills to use those? And we're finding a lot of requests and support requests lately about that sort of area, especially when people are moving on to digital. And the hardest hit actually are disabled people, older people, asylum seekers and refugees. And the bottom stat, the last stat, is 3 million people are colourblind. So it affects 1 in 12 men, more likely to be men than women. But if you're thinking about the colours, you really need to think about an audience that is, would never probably describe themselves as disabled, but it would affect their communication. And the last one is on diversity. So thinking about the diverse groups that we have, 59% of people are Christian, 25% have no religious belief, 5% are Muslim, 6% are gay, lesbian or bisexual, 3% Black British, 18% are over the age of 65, 2% are British mixed race, 86% are white, and 8% are Asian, British Asian. So that is your audience. And you could always take some of the cross sections of your own audiences and try to figure out actually what barriers might they have in our communications. So the law protects disabled people. So the Equality Act 2010 merged with the Disability Discrimination Act. So it will protect disabled people along with other characteristics. You need to understand the potential that discrimination could arise. So for example, the important thing is about making reasonable adjustments. So disabled people have the right to access your information in the way that they can and need it. So that might be that they can't read your delivered leaflet, they can't read the printed leaflet, and they would request a digital copy. Or they might want a large print version. They have the right to access that, and if they can't, they'd be asking questions. So always a good thing to have those sort of formats, or definitely suppliers to hand. So why should we know our audience? One size doesn't fit all. So, you know, one person with sight loss won't necessarily be the same next person with another person with sight loss. But we can try and look at those barriers and really expect and understand those audiences and how communication affects those audiences. So don't assume your audience don't have any requirements. A lot of people might come to us and say, well, I've never been asked. I've never had a request in. Could that be because the forms that they have to request it on aren't accessible? Or actually, you might be doing the right thing, so that'd be great. But actually, you should be thinking about, are our communications available for a mass audience? So we know our audience's barriers in communication, do you? One of those barriers might be language. So when we talk about terminology, it's always a tricky subject because a lot of people are asking, they're a bit scared about the language that we use around disability. Do they use the right language? Is somebody going to be offended? Is somebody going to tell me off? Is somebody going to embarrass me? The important point about language is that you're best, if it's a one-on-one situation, you are best to ask that person what they prefer. Language is very subjective, so you've got to really understand that it's very personal to a lot of people. When it comes to disability, you'll find that there's two models, social model and medical model of disability. I haven't got time to describe that big thesis to you today, but I'd certainly say it's extra reading for you. And social and medical model is a really interesting area in terms of language. Scope, charities like Scope will have a nice video on that. But you'll see the language that I've got on the left-hand side, which is the do use, which is disabled person instead of the disabled, handicapped, crippled. Non-disabled person, you'll hear me say non-disabled person quite a lot. Person with a certain condition, so you can say something like person with muscular dystrophy, for example. A wheelchair or mobility scooter user instead of wheelchair bound. Anything bound, anything confined is really not perceived as positive. Learning disability or person with intellectual or learning impairment, person with short stature, restricted growth, deaf or hard of hearing, and then blind or visually impaired person, people who are partially sighted, and then not grouping people into terms of the deaf, the blind, can be really quite offensive, especially when you write. A lot of our papers that we read every day, you might find a lot of those avoid words on the right hand side might be used more often. So our organisation is jargon free and we promote plain English. Now when I can see all your faces in workshops, I usually see a lot of smiles coming from this question. We all know that, you know, within an organisation that jargon free and plain English can be quite tricky to get the buy-in for. Anyone who understands a lot about plain English will understand how hard it is to actually not just do it yourself, but convince other people of how to do it. So any of you who have been trained in it will know it's about cutting down that jargon. The average sentence length is 15 to 20 words. You use everyday words, and it's first and second pronouns, we, us, and you, and using active sentence, not passive ones. There is a website on it. You can always get training on it. There is online training as well. So if any of us have time at the moment, it's a really good training module to do. Certainly it changes your eye on certain things when you read sentences. It makes you think a lot differently about the sentence structure that you use. But there is readability as well. So any of you who've learned about readability in Microsoft Word, it's a really good tool to use. So you can actually scan through all the words that you've written on a document and find out what the reading age is. And you'll be looking for probably around a score of 60 to 70 if it's a web copy. You might want to try some of the documents that you get through on a daily basis, some of your strategies, some of your really high top end documents, and just maybe give or take, you know, some of the documents that you send through to tell your colleagues what the reading age is of their documents. Try it and see. So one of those other barriers is fonts. All of you, I'm sure, will have a corporate font, and they tend to split into two sections, serif and sans serif. Serif tends to be things like Times New Roman, they're quite twiddly. Sans serif tends to be the Verdana, the Calibri, Arial, those sort of fonts that are a lot rounder, and they are easier to read. So I'd be looking for you to have a font that is without those twiddly bits, so the Arials of the world. And on the screen, you'll see a lot of different versions. So people who use screen readers, so if you might be visually impaired or you might have dexterity issues, it might read the information back to you. If you have things like italics, all capitals, underlining your words, it might read it in a certain way or will not be easy on the eye. So anyone who's tried to read a paragraph in italic font will know it's quite tricky. We've all learnt to read and write in a certain way, and if it's not natural to the eye, it's quite difficult to read on screen. So just think about making sure you are minimalising those sort of features. So I wouldn't be looking at doing a whole paragraph in bold, for example, or a whole paragraph in all capital letters. The other barriers in colour and alignment. So the first example I've given is colour. You will have colour palette amongst your brands. Have you tested these for contrast checking? So have you tested the foreground against the background? Some fonts and colours are much easier to read than others. So have you made sure that those fonts pass those checks? You can do those checks free online. So all you have to do is put the foreground and the background colour in. So if you're designing a document, for example, you will probably put the different Pantone into the foreground and the background. It needs to pass at least a AA. So there'll be 3 settings. There'll be A, AA, and AAA. That is the accessibility standards that you're looking for, especially in digital. Websites are built to those same standards as well. And we'll talk about websites in a little bit. The middle section is about colour blindness that we spoke about before. So the point to raise about that is where you're leading with colour. So if you're telling somebody to go and use, follow the green button or follow the red button, if you can't see those colours, it's really tricky. So you need to double up on that. You need to make sure there's probably a shape with it or a word with it, and make sure you're not depending on colour to do the actions for you. And the right-hand side is really about alignment. So we talk about left alignment all the time, so that words aren't actually spread out over the page. And that matters not just for people who are visually impaired, but people who might have dyslexia, for example, where white space causes a lot of issues. Images. So our images are inclusive and show disabled people in a range of our work. And there's 4 types of barriers that you might have amongst your images. Here are some don'ts. The first picture you'll see is actually where font is over image. We see that a lot in design work. So where you've got font over image, it can be really difficult to read because there's a lot of busyness behind the scenes. So people won't be necessarily be able to read it. What I'd probably do if that picture, because it's got a yellow balloon, I probably would have put black font over the yellow balloon if you really wanted to put it over the image. But you can do it with things like color blocks behind. The second image is of a tube map. So if we think about where the meaning is only color, we just spoke about that, about color blindness. If you're telling somebody to go on the green line or the brown line, what happens if they can't see that color? Third one is infographics. So where it's too much information, overload. We all love an infographic. There's quite a lot of time recently where everyone was just putting infographics everywhere. So is it clear? Is there too much information? Is there too much going on your screen? And the fourth one is about negative portrayal. So photos that show disabled people lonely, on their own, not mixing amongst the other peers, those sort of negative portrayals really affect how disabled people see themselves and how others see disabled people. So nobody has asked me for a resource in another format. The other alternative formats that you might already know about might be accessible PDFs, for example. A lot of people don't know that actually the PDFs that we all talk about are not actually accessible. So if they're not set up in the right way, or the designers don't know how to set up an accessible PDF, you might actually be giving inaccessible documents, even though you hoped they were. Now, the thing about accessible PDFs are, the design one, you need to make sure your designers are aware of how to do that. But if you are saving as a PDF from Word, for example, Word is brilliant in terms of accessibility. So you can do an accessibility checker on Word. Make sure you do that. And then when that Word document is accessible, when you save as PDF, it will carry all those features over and make your document accessible. Then there's the Word documents. So if you've made sure those accessible documents are great, they're a really good alternative format for you. So if somebody says, I can't understand and I can't read your beautifully designed document, please send me a Word document, you can do that. Audio descriptions are where, for example, videos or your TV programs might have a description that describes what's happening, because there's a lot of action happening, but there's not a lot of audio. So it'd be probably a voiceover over your different videos. Captioning and BSL interpretation on videos, Easyread, which is a form where it's pictorial next to a plain English sentence, and then text messaging. Always amazes me actually when people run campaigns where they might have a specific audience who might have hearing loss or might be deaf, that actually SMS campaigns might be the better source to do that campaign. Plain text versions of newsletters and transcripts, and then Braille. Now, I'll never say don't do Braille, because there's definitely a market where audience will actually require Braille, but only 9,000 people read Braille in the country. So if you can concentrate a lot on your accessibility of your digital, it certainly helps to complement that alternative format. This is an example of Easyread that we spoke about. I love Easyread, so I probably wouldn't class myself as the main audience that this probably targets, but we all, when we get sent 80-page documents, wouldn't we all like a 2-page back-to-back flyer of actually just saying what it does on the tin? So where there's short sentences that people can just digest in one go. So as we've said before, one size doesn't fit all, but there might be similar barriers in particular impairment groups. So for blind visual impairment groups, you might probably all of those barriers on the right-hand side, you probably find there are barriers within those communications, all of them. So print, websites, videos, posters, images, language, layout, PDFs, infographics. If you're deaf or have hearing loss, you might find that websites or videos and language might be the barrier. Our website is tested for accessibility. So I really hope, especially right now, that you probably think about your website and how accessible they are. As we move into this mass digital phase, actually, when people turn to your website as their first point of call, can they access the information readily and easily? The worldwide accessibility guidelines have an initiative that actually you can read up on, and your designers, if they know the agencies that you work with, the digital teams you work with, should really be aware of those accessibility guidelines. And as I said, it's built in 3 standards, so A, AA, AAA. AAA being amazing, so AAA will probably be more likely the lines of the BBC. A would be very basic, but AA is an expectation for accessibility. So if I was briefing an agency for a website, I would be expecting them to know about the accessibility guidelines, and I would be expecting a website to be built to AA standard. I would test that in digital agencies that you employ to do your work, or in-house, you'd be looking for your teams to know about those standards and what makes a website inaccessible. Good homework reading is the Click Away Pound report, which ranks the most common website issues faced by all users with access needs. And if you look at those lists, it's crowded pages with too much content, it's capture tests. So, you know, if you've ever done a reCAPTCHA test which says tick all the boxes that has a car in it, and you sit there and if you've got full vision, then you'll be thinking, okay, yeah, and I can see the car in that box. If you haven't got vision, how are you going to know that, you know, there's a car in that box? Poor link information, navigation, filling in forms, poor color contrast, distracting moving images. So a lot of people might have home pages that have a video playing instantly, which can be really distracting if you're using assistive technology. Or poor keyboard access or poor screen reader access. When it comes to social media, there's a lot to learn about social media, but certainly the top principles that I've put on the slide today are image descriptions. So those channels that you use, do you know how to put what's called an alternative description behind your images? All of them have it set up. There are always ways that you can describe what that image is, rather than just expect people to know what that image is showing. Emojis, everyone loves an emoji, but if you overpower that post with an emoji, it doesn't necessarily read back out to you if you've got a screen reader the same as what you think it might do. So it's minimal emojis, and make sure you read up what those emojis actually mean on a screen reader. It might not necessarily be the description you think it is. With videos, you have to make sure that, one, there's captions, but also that you're thinking about the audio. Does the audio say what that video is doing? So if not, you need to start thinking about the formats that you're putting up on your posts. Subtitles, everyone needs subtitles these days. We might have a baby sleeping in the other room and we can't play it loudly. You might want to watch something else that, you know, your partner's not watching in the house. So everyone requires subtitles, so always make sure that that is briefed in. And what's called camel case. So in hashtags, everyone loves a hashtag. It's where you capitalize the first letter of each word within that hashtag. It just means that when somebody who's using a screen reader, it would actually read that word properly. And then let your teams or yourself read up on those accessibility features, because they're forever changing. And certainly people are bringing out different features. So make sure you know about those new features that, you know, Twitter might bring out or Facebook might bring out. So let's run through the checklist. Thinking audience, channels, and message. Championing accessibility across the organisation is probably the biggest thing that you all have to do. It's empowering the teams to improve and share knowledge and getting that senior buy-in, because it's not going to be all free. There will have to be a budget allocation, but it's worth it in the end, because as we've spoken about before, the cost implications can be quite high if you haven't got it right from the start. Enroll on that training and add to the staff CPD. So make sure they do those Microsoft little video training that they can do. Plain English training is always good for everybody. Because what tends to happen in accessibility is, oh, it's marketing's department, it's their fault, it's their problem. Let them think about the accessibility. Communication is everybody's job. So we all communicate in some way, whether it's via email, phone, website, newsletter. Let everyone buy into that and champion accessibility. Brief and choose your suppliers wisely, and I can't speak more highly about this. Have a list of suppliers who care about accessibility, because they make your life easier. So designers that just know that you're not using the right colour, designers that know it's not accessible, really help you in the long run. Mix up your channels, don't rely on just one. So a lot of campaigns was like, oh, we're running a social media campaign, but actually, are you really going to target the audience you're intending to reach? So mix it up, think about different channels. Use the accessibility checkers available. As I've said, Microsoft is brilliant if you know where those checkers are. Use a range of accessible formats. So thinking about how many people you want to reach. Are you going to reach everybody? Could you help yourself by putting another format there? Make sure font is easy to read, jargon free, and 12 point for print or larger. Ensure good color contrast for font and design, and then use an inclusive images with alt description behind on your website and the social media. Provide a range of contact points. This always makes me raise my eyebrows when some people send me things to check and they only put a phone number or they only put an email, because that's the easiest way that they want to be contacted. But actually, we should be opening up the world for people to contact us. So some people won't be using a telephone, some people won't be using an email or can't. So you've got to provide a range of contact points. The last two are really important in terms of co-producing and testing communications with who you're trying to reach. So those testing with a diverse audience, could you have a panel of people that actually have a range of probably different barriers, and that's age groups as well as impairments, and actually ask them before you put out information, could you say, could you just look over this for me? When I'm building a new website, can you just check these 5 pages for me and just feedback whether there's any problems with them? And then monitor and change in response to what your audiences need. We all have to do that. Communications change, we change, the features change. So actually we need to move with the audiences that we want to reach. And that's the whistle-stop tour of what we talk about in terms of inclusive communications. That is me, if you do want to talk to me, with 2 contact points. But you can reach me on social media. I'm sure you can find us through Activity Alliance. Do contact me if you have any questions, but remember the guides are there and the fact sheets are there for you to use as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a very, very interesting presentation, and I'm sure that most of our attendees will have found something they didn't know before. So now we're going to spend these last 10 minutes of the webinar on answering questions from our attendees. So Sarah, I think we've got 2 questions in the question and answer box. So do feel free to answer any of them.
Okay. Where can I find the readability check on Word? I can only see the accessibility check. Depends which version you're working in. But if you go to issues and then it pulls up, if you go to spell check and then after it's run through all the spell check, it will give you a readability score as well. Bear in mind it's American. So you might have to get Steve on the phone, but certainly you can work out, it will give you a what's called a flat score, and it will be in grade, and you can always translate that in Google, and it'll give you a grade age for that. I think the last question probably said that.
We have a few more questions that have come in. So we've got a question from Phil. In your opinion, what percentage of communications is not compliant, and is compliancy moving in the right direction? So has it got better over the past 5 years or so?
It depends what you mean by compliant. Certainly, I've seen a lot more people be very aware of accessibility standards. In the digital world, they should know, especially working with digital agencies, they should be knowing what the accessibility standards are because they're worldwide, and the public sector has to make their websites accessible. It's law. So why aren't we doing it across different business sectors? It will cost you more if somebody is coming to you with a lawsuit. The only things that are happening with the lawsuit is that it's based on individuals wanting to do that. So we need to make sure we're more compliant. I couldn't give you a percentage because I'd have to look at every bit of communication that's ever existed. Do you think COVID-19 will give rise to opportunities for businesses to strengthen their accessibility offerings, or do you think override it? I think it's a really great opportunity for every sector to do more and think about inclusion on a bigger scale. If they haven't, it worries me because if anybody's heard me speak in the last sort of few weeks, lockdown has flagged an area of social isolation. Social isolation will exist long past lockdown. So if we're not thinking about these things now, we need to, we need to carry those principles across with us. Just because we're out and free the next few weeks or the next few months doesn't mean that we should not thinking about these things right now and forever. And then I know that name, Andy Dolby Welsh, is saying, do you offer bespoke training to organisations? We do. Obviously, we specialise in sport and activity, and we will always talk about messaging for sport and activity. So if you were to get a flavour of if you were a sports organisation, you'd probably get a different flavour in terms of messaging. But you would certainly, if we've worked with different sectors, and obviously I've been into the UN Global Compact, and we've worked with different sectors within that group. So we do lots of training, and we are probably one of the specialists in it. There's not many of us. But there's obviously also other bespoke training, like things like the Plain English campaign that you can do yourselves. Any more?
There's another question from Andy. So you mentioned Lloyd's in your presentation. Is there anyone in sport who is doing a great job at inclusive communications?
Activity Alliances. so I would hope we are. They're getting better. I mean, certainly we had such an interest in our work, that a lot of people are seeing the buy-in and the impact of actually being more accessible and inclusive in their communications. So yes, there's quite a few organizations that are definitely biting into it. There's nobody that I could probably give as a flying example. But I know there's a lot of organizations coming forward now that know that they need to embed those principles to be much better.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. If anyone else has any questions, we do have 4 minutes left, so do feel free to type them into the Q&A box. But I also had a question for you, Sarah. So since you mentioned the like differences in diversity and how like communications needs to be tailored to different groups, I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about different words and terms that may differ from different languages and cultures? So for example, here in the UK, disabled people is the norm, but in the US, I believe handicapped is used a bit more frequently.
Yes. I have to get Steve back on for that, but certainly so language, as I spoke about, is very subjective, and internationally the translation might be very different. So France, for example, would be a straight translation to the handicap. So you've got to think about the nation you're working with. And we in the UK, I can probably only talk about the UK, we have a social medical model that we use quite fluently. So person with a disability is not a bad term, because as disabled people, we're not born knowing what the social model is of disability. And the social model is, if you read up on it, it's more about society is causing disability. It's not the person that owns it. So I'm a disabled person because society has made me feel that way, and the attitude that comes towards me, or the stares that I might have to face. Disability is society, it's not the person. So we own our impairments, we don't own disability. So that's why you'll find us saying disabled person, not person with disability. However, it's not a totally bad phrase that people use. And you will see that a lot in sport, person with disability.
I'm just going to pipe up at the moment just to, firstly, I speak American, but I'm actually Canadian. So,
sorry.
No, that's okay. But but that's a very real challenge that I face. It really took me quite a long time to clue in that I wasn't supposed to say handicapped here, and so I've at long last mostly fixed it. I also wanted to just say a word on the word question about the readability, because I just had a check, and it is, as you say, if you go through a spelling and grammar check and run all the way through the document, in the check there will be a settings, and it looks like the readability thing is not a default, so you do need to go into settings, tick the readability statistics box, and then when you finish the grammar check, you will get a box that will give you the Flesch reading ease, Flesch Kincaid grade level, and the number of passive sentences that you've got. I don't know, Sarah, do you know what the Flesch reading ease number is and what that means? Is that something you've seen before?
It was the numbers that I showed you before earlier. So it's got a grading, it'll give you an actual grading of the age group. So you need to find out what that grade is and what age group that is.
Right, so mine is saying 36.1 for the Flesch reading ease, but the grade level 12.9. So I guess we need to make that a little easier before we send it out to the world.
Yeah, I mean, you can Google that.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've reached the end, so I'm going to say thank you from myself, Sarah. I found that really tremendously interesting, and I'm going to just pass back to Carla to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Sarah. I think this presentation has been really interesting, and I hope that you as our attendees have found it useful. And thank you for your enthusiasm on this topic. I mean, we all think that the inclusive communications is important at any time, but especially recently with this COVID-19 situation we're all facing. And yeah, thank you very much for registering and for attending this webinar. And if you'd like to know more about what we do as the UK network of the Global Compact, please visit our website or contact us or follow us, contact us via our email, follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. All right, thank you very much.